welcome. Exciting day here. I'm Eric Stewart, and I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Ramiro Martinez for the Oral History Project, and I go way back with Dr. Martinez. So just a little bit in terms of background. Dr. Martinez received his PhD from Ohio State, his master's degree from Southwest Texas State, his undergrad degree from Southwest Texas State University.
Yeah, that's right.
I left the university.
Texas State University now.
Yes, Texas State University now. Okay. You've been a recipient of a number of awards, from the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Society of Criminology Division of People of Color Crime, to Distinguished Alumni Achievement, the Corey Mayor Ritchie Award. The list just goes on and on, so it's an impressive list. Can you tell us just a little bit about how you got started?
I got started in criminology.
Yes.
Well, academically, my criminological roots are, I guess, in San Antonio, Texas. Right, I was born and raised there. My studies, I guess, started in the early '80s. Right, I had just graduated from high school. Actually, the year I graduated from high school in San Antonio was the first year that the majority of Mexican Americans, as we were called at the time, had graduated from high school. Right before that, the high school dropout rate in San Antonio was astronomically high. So in many ways, getting a high school degree was seen as a form of higher education. I was sort of, listless for a couple of years. I guess younger people now would call it, I was kicking it, or I was doing different types of seasonal jobs, or, working in different places. And I was, I was lost. And my best friend from high school, Daniel Benson, told me that I should think about, going to college. And I said, well, how do I do that? He said, well, you fill out this application form and, help me through that process. And of course, when you're being asked certain questions, like what do you want your major, what do you want to major in? And I was grappling with actually history and criminal justice, just because I thought the topic was interesting, right? Not to denigrate anybody or anything, but it just seemed like I had a lot of family members and a lot of people in my old neighborhood that were doing time, right? They were either in TDC or they were in county, and for some reason it struck me as, that wasn't normal, right? That wasn't something that most people thought about or most people, endured or encountered in their family or their community. And that's when I actually started thinking a little bit more about studying criminal justice.
Okay. So you took basically what we would call now a couple gap years.
Yeah. I took a couple of gap years. I was trying to find myself, if I was going to go fight, with the Sandinistas, or if I was going to fight against them. It was one of those, those trips. And it was interesting. Now that I think back on it, right, there was probably, a lot of pressure to sort of step up and, do something a little bit more, beneficial to society and, or, my family, and that's how I started. Okay. I went off to college by accident.
Okay.
I wanted to get away from home, and I didn't want to join the Marines, which was the other option.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about mentors who have encouraged you, like who's been sort of inspirational and kind of helping you here?
Yeah, there are quite a few. Actually, my undergrad years, there was Dr. David Jorgensen at Southwest Texas State University, or for those of you that are bilingual, it's Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas. So Dr. Jorgensen was a sociology professor. Susan Day was a sociology professor at the time as well, and they were both very instrumental in helping me, right? As an undergraduate, I think they saw, some sort of potential, and I found the research invigorating, and I was excited by it. And Dr. Jorgensen was instrumental because he helped me think about research questions, right? And helped me think about not just the topic, but the actual investigation. He also chaired my master's thesis. My master's thesis was a study of acculturation among Mexican American students, right, in San Marcos, Texas. So I was able to he guided that process from start to finish. That was my first large-scale data collection process. Filling out questionnaires, getting people to participate, doing the whole gamut of from start to finish. And I think, now that I think back on it, right, that was sort of the hook, right? That's what really sort of brought me in, was passing out questionnaires, entering data, analyzing the data, and trying to figure out what the range was, right, of assimilation among this population that was under-investigated, I think, at the time, but I didn't realize until later that that group was not only under-investigated, but for the most part ignored in the rest of the country.
Okay. Is there any sort of kind of a biographical connection to kind of your background growing up and kind of what you study? Or
what do you mean by biographical?
So kind of, you talk about where you grew up,
right?
You kind of highlighted that. Has any of that influenced sort of your research agenda or what you're interested in studying?
Yeah, I mean, I was always interested in violence. It seems, I hate to say it now, but it seems sort of normal and routine at some points in my life. And I think that later on, as I started to investigate this phenomenon, right, I didn't realize it was probably the rarest of rare crimes, right? But it just seemed something that was more intimate, right, at that point in life. The other thing was that in 1966, right, I don't think I've ever shared this with anybody, but it's really relatively recent. I was at what's called the City of San Antonio, the Battle of Flowers Parade, right? And this is, you're sitting in these seats and watching these floats and go by, and I started hearing these firecrackers, right? This is in 1978, the floats had gone through and the band started to come, and I hear these firecrackers, right? And I thought, well, that's interesting. I never noticed it before. And I turned to my left, and I saw this smoke, right, coming out of this Winnebago. I said, well, that's weird. And I looked across the street, and I saw people starting to fall, right? And so what had happened, to make a long story short, was that there was a mass shooting by this guy named Ira Atterbury, where he had killed, I think, 2 or 3 people. He injured dozens of people at the parade. And the reason I remember it was because I noticed that people started running, right? They started running away from the van. And I had I was next to the van. I was sort of in the, in the blind spot, right, of where the shooter, he was shooting at people around, but I was at an angle. So I was fortunate. I saw him pointing in my direction, right, and I saw people started going down, and I saw the life go out of one person's, eyes when they hit the floor, and the blood was, on the cement, and but anyway, to make a long story short, that was really the first encounter I had, right, with serious violence. And I think, of course, now thinking back on it for several years, I never went back to the Battle of Flowers Parade, which is like somebody in New Orleans never going to Mardi Gras. But now, of course, I think back on it, and it was probably a much more traumatic experience than I realized, right? But it was also something that sort of piqued my interest. Right, because I was interested in studying this. That's probably how I dealt with the trauma. Right, I started thinking about this topic on a macro issue instead of a personal issue. Right, and I think as I focus back, this is probably something. Maybe it didn't shape my research interest in violence, but it certainly did, right, spark it.
Okay. So you've done a lot of work, and we've read a lot of work. Like your research is mandatory reading for our students taking comps, and just thinking about homicides. And you've published Latino Homicide.
Right.
Yeah. Can you kind of take us through that a little bit, and kind of what the kind of major contributions you see that happening?
My research interest?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I've published in the area of Latino violence, Latino homicides. I've published, several different books. The first book, of course, is probably kind of the standard now, 2001, Latino Homicide. And so what started my interest in that topic was really kind of basic. I was in graduate school at Ohio State. I was in Ruth Peterson's, I believe her first inequality and crime course. And, of course we had, different topics and different topics each week that we covered. And one week there was, I think, about 5 articles on what was known as sort of the Hispanic Week, or weekend, I guess is what I would call it now. And there were 5 articles, right? And I'm looking through these articles, and I still remember them. I think there was an article by Gary LaFree, Marjorie Zetz, Howard Dodestall, who else? Gary LaFree, and a couple of other articles. I'm embarrassed. The names of 2 others sort of slipped my mind at the moment, but. We were reading these articles. They dealt primarily with racial and ethnic biases and sentencing. And, I remember thinking, well, is this it? Right? There's got to be more, right? This is probably 1988 or 99. It's obvious to me, right? I was born and raised in San Antonio, in Texas. And,
Yes.
I grew up on the west side of San Antonio, by the Alizon, my parents grew up by the Alizon Apache Course, which is the largest barrio in San Antonio, and they were like, well, yeah, this is it. There were 5 articles. I was like, that's it? Gotta be kidding. And I didn't realize it at the time, of course. Ruth was very, generous and gracious, but she said, yes, that's, that we don't know a lot about Hispanics, and so we started talking, and of course, you have to remember, this is during the era of the crack cocaine epidemic, so there was a lot of attention paid to youth violence,
yes.
Especially among African American communities. And I asked Ruth, well, what's, she would talk about the youth violence rate, the gap between blacks and whites, and I asked her, well, where's the Hispanic homicide rate? What's the Mexican American homicide rate? And she said, I don't know. It's not obvious. It's not, it's not something readily available. So, I was curious, of course. I was interested in violence, and I went and asked Cy Dennett, who was my mentor at Ohio State, if he knew anything about the topic. And it's funny because at that time, Cy's son-in-law, Professor Dennett's son-in-law, lives in San Antonio. One of his daughters and their kids relocated to San Antonio, and he said no, but we should study that topic. So that was always at the back of my mind, was that for some reason there was this ignored or overlooked group, but yet to me it seemed obvious that this is a population that should be studied, and there's this population that has these historical origins, at least at that time in the southwestern United States, and this is a population that has very different types of social and economic inequality than African Americans or non-Latino whites, or actually at the time we were called Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Anglo Americans.
Yes.
Right? This is before the big immigration influx, so the population was heavily native born, and so there was these 3 different types of large and racial and ethnic groups in the United States, and especially in the urban areas. So I didn't realize it at the time, but it was sort of in the back of my mind that this is something that, we should study, we should focus on this. It's pretty obvious to me, and the problems or the issue, became something that I sort of kept on my radar, right? It sort of incubated for a couple of years. And
So you mentioned the sparsity of research,
Right.
looking at the Latino population and having information just in terms of Latino homicide rates.
Right.
So how were you able to gain access or get information?
Yeah, that's a good question. The issue for me was that, we didn't know anything. There was no rate, there was no extent, there was no comparisons. I think in 1980 nationally, the Supplemental Homicide Report did provide information on, the Hispanic identifier for a couple of years, and then it sort of disappeared for different reasons. I think most police departments just weren't interested, or there was no need to fill out that information. The places that did, fill out that information, again, we're in the southwestern United States, and of course, in Chicago, New York City, and Miami. So the issue became, well, what do I do? So I worked with some of that early data. I was interested in seeing and examining the social and economic characteristics of Latino homicides across the United States. What were sort of, the correlates of crime? What were the determinants? The whole thing, of course, that was, motivating my interest was that we knew that there were, racial differences between blacks and whites, and well, there's got to be differences where this other group, exists, and were they somewhere in the middle? Were they more like whites? Were they more like African Americans? Did context matter? What were the correlates? Where were they highest in? So that's something I examined in the first article in 1996 in Social Problems dealt with what I called the impact of poverty and inequality on Latino homicides, and that was really my first big hit, right? It was my first major article, and there was pushback against it, right? I mean, even at that time, some people, I remember some of the reviewers didn't think that there was this need to, I had to make the argument for, the need to examine this group separately, right, from blacks or whites, and some people were arguing, well, they're white, so there's no need to sort of disaggregate this group from others, so I had to, focus on addressing that article. And other people were saying, well, in some places like New York City, Chicago, they're more like African Americans,
Yeah.
so I had to focus on, addressing that topic. And fortunately for me, the article was published, and I started thinking about, well, what are the next steps, right? Well, what should I do? And about that time, I was still reading these piles of criminology issues that were on my desk, and there was this one article that was sort of resuscitating, right, the need for the study of communities and crime. It was by this guy, I think his name was Bob Bursick or something, and Bob was really sort of instrumental, right, in bringing the study of communities and crime, in my opinion, back into mainstream criminology. We really didn't have that type of macro level research or community level research. It wasn't as strong as it is now, and I think part of it at the time in the 80s was due to technology. It was just very difficult to access census tract data, and of course crime data, and then the problems that we're familiar with. It was very different. And so Bob sort of, I read these articles, right, and of course I started reading all the other articles in Chicago on communities and crime, and that sort of gave me some direction on what I should think about as kind of the next steps.
Okay. You mentioned sort of resistance, if you will,
Right.
to kind of what you were doing. How were you able to overcome sort of the pushback?
That's a good question. I overcame the pushback by being naive and eager enough to go and collect original data.
Okay.
Right, and of course, I went and collected the original data in the most immigrant, most Latino place in the United States, and that was in the city of Miami. ASC met, I think it was 1988 or 1989, in the city of Miami, and a former colleague of mine at the University of Delaware, Jim Inciardi, had several projects going on in Miami, and he was known as sort of a Miami guy. And I had been, talking to Jim, discussing some of the ways in which I could study, right, this ethnic group, right, in Miami, and the ways he was studying this group, and sort of incorporating that information. And I said, Jim, do you have a hookup? Can you hook me up into, someone that, knows where I can get data in the city of Miami? And of course, Jim knew, Jim couldn't do it himself, but he knew someone that knew everyone, right, in the city of Miami. And I was fortunate enough that he directed me to, someone on his research staff that was, friends with and that knew professionally the city of Miami police chief. So, while we were there, I was curious about, how do I access, data, or, I was interested in seeing, what sort of information they had, and it was just, timing, right? I sort of showed up, they were interested, the police people, the police chief and the assistant police chief were sort of interested in reaching out at that time, to people that were interested in homicides and crime and in Miami. And I was at the University of Delaware, so they were bringing me in as, the guy from up north, right? The guy from New Jersey, or the guy from Baltimore, or, this, Doc is coming in from New Jersey and studying us, so, but I didn't and you have to realize too, data collection is very different than it is now. I think they had just invented the first the first laptop. Right, it was like 500 pounds or something, but you could carry it through, and I could carry this laptop, and there's I think probably the first Excel version, and entering all this data and typing in all this information, and that's sort of how I started this original data collection process. Was they gave me access to some of the annual homicide reports they had created. They gave me access to some of the more detailed internal, homicide supplemental reports. And of course, they gave me access to the police department, right, which was pretty unique at the time, right? I even had a little ID at some point, right, that said Ramiro Martinez criminalist, I think, is what my, I was officially called in. So I'd go into the police department, I would collect data, I was, typing this information in, and after a while, the detectives are there, and, I just, they asked me if I wanted to go to lunch, and I said, yeah, sure. So, they're showing me the city, and, I'm interested in how the communities are shaped and detailed, and, sort of the flavor for the city, and a call comes out, right, that there's a fresh shooting, and so I'm with the detectives, and they're like, all right, Doc, we have to go and investigate this killing, and so, off we go, and that was my access, right, my observation of the first time that I saw somebody collect, right, data or information, or I saw somebody collect, or, they're filling out this information on ethnicity, right, and they're filling out this information on race, which is, what I thought was important for me to sort of figure out, how people are making this distinction between, white, black, and Latino, and it's like,
how was this?
Wasn't that tough? I mean, we're in Liberty City, we're in the North End, right?
Okay, the North End.
We're in this African American community. I'm looking around. I'm the only person that's not African American, and looks like for a block, and And you have to remember too, this is during the peak of the crack cocaine
Oh, yeah.
epidemic. So, we were there on, I forget maybe it was 57th Avenue, so we're on the avenue, and it's just, it was just teeming with activity, right? I mean, it was this huge open air drug market, and it was just a very different time and place. So I would say that it was exciting for me because there was a lot of homicide data during that time point, especially in that community. But I didn't realize, how quickly that would change, right? After about 5 or 10 years later, the homicide levels declined, but that's another story. But what was important for me was that I was able to sort of hang out, right? I was able to watch them collect data. I was able to watch them work cases from start to finish. I saw how they worked other cases in other Latino communities, and out Woodwood, Little Havana, and in other places. So I was able to, examine this, homicide data collection process from start to finish. Right, from, they're filling out this information to, they're putting the cuffs on this bad guy and, taking him in. And so I was able to examine how homicide detectives worked, right? How they worked cases, how they filled out all that information, how they interviewed witnesses, how we read, or how I read, right, the information that was included in the supplemental reports. I think, later on it became, clear to me, it was obvious, what the motivations were, most of the time, and it wasn't that difficult to think about, especially when you think about the impact of drugs and alcohol use, especially alcohol use, but that was something I didn't realize at the time. So for me, it was important to examine that data collection process up close. Right, it was rare, I think. And that's something that I was fortunate, right? It just happened to be something particular about the time and place. It happened to be something particular about the homicide detectives, and of course, the chief and police chief, and the people that helped me, gain access to the 5th floor.
To the 5th floor?
Yeah.
And did you wear your little badge?
Yeah.
You went back to Delaware? Did you have one?
So I went back to Delaware, I had my little name tag, my little badge and stuff.
Criminalist?
Criminalist,
When you look back over your career, not that like your career's over or anything.
Thanks for mentioning
I
that.
don't want to post that. No.
I feel like dead man walking. I'm like, am I at the end or something? I just don't know something.
No. So is there something that you, a particular project or something you worked on that you view as sort of your, I'm most proud of this piece, or I'm most proud of this accomplishment in terms of research?
Yeah, I would say it's the 2002 Latino homicide book, right? Because I collected original data for several years, which I wouldn't recommend to assistant professors now. But at that time point, you go in, you start collecting original data, and each time you leave with the knowledge knowing you might not be let back in, right? So, but I kept on going back. And I kept on going back to Miami. It gave me access, right, to people that were doing research on policing. I was able to meet the police chief of the San Diego City of San Diego Police Department, Jerry Sanders, at a conference. The only way I would have been that I was invited to that conference is because of the findings from Miami. So. I started collecting data in San Diego again. This was, I went and visited San Diego at the American Society of Criminology. I think that was maybe 96, 97. And again, so I'm accessing data in Miami. I'm accessing data in the City of San Diego Police Department. Very different cultures, right? Very different styles of working cases, very different Latino communities, of course, right? Even though San Diego's on the border, the police department itself is not on the border, right? It's downtown. It's more closed off, more 9 to 5. The number of homicides were far lower than in the city of Miami. I didn't see any open air drug markets or anything like that, like you see, like I saw in the 305, right? It was a very different, feel. It was a very clearly the homicides were in old Mexican American barrios, right? That looked more like my parents' and grandparents' neighborhoods. Right? So it felt, that felt comfortable. But that's when I realized, of course, that the racial history in Miami, right, was more like the Confederate South, and the impact of the new immigration in Miami was made the place very unique to study, but it also made it very different, right, than other places of the United States. So that's when, right, I started to think about, well, what does this mean, and how do I detail this definition of Latino? But also, I think I'm proud of the data collection in those two cities because it reminded me that Latinos aren't the only immigrant group, right? They're not the only immigrant group by far, right? The city of San Diego, for example, had a large influx of Southeast Asian populations, refugees during that time period. There were parts of the city that had new Vietnamese refugees, and that community had had some spikes for a couple of years. The city of Miami, as we know, right, Little Haiti, right, was adjacent to Liberty City, but for some reason, the level of homicides in Little Haiti weren't nearly as high as they were in Liberty City. So that helped me think about not only the impact of race and ethnicity, but also how immigration works and how it varies, at least in the United States.
Okay. Just thinking in terms of your work again, has it challenged any sort of traditional stereotypes that may be out there, or in terms of Latino population?
My work?
No, has your work challenged any?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, not your work.
Yeah, maybe a little bit.
No, just challenge some of the stereotypes that
Right.
exist. And again, I know we're talking. You're coming along at a time where there wasn't a lot of
Right.
research and crim on this particular
Right.
population. Right?
Yeah, I mean that was the initial frustration, right? Was that of course technology is very different now than it was in the late '90s, early 2000s, and let me start back. When I started engaging in the study of Latino homicides, right, I just assumed that there were going to be extremely high homicide rates among Latinos, right, in general. I assumed that because there were, extremely high levels of poverty, extremely high levels of economic disadvantage, high levels of young males, right, sort of all the ingredients that we thought existed, right, at the macro level that contributed to homicide. So of course, I see this in the Latino population, and, I'm engaging in some of the early data runs, right? We used to have these things, they're called old reel-to-reel tapes that we used to have to run, and people would, manually put them on and take them off, and we were doing our initial statistical runs, and I was, surprised that the homicide rates were nearly as high as I expected. Right, so I kept on investigating again, I kept on looking at it closer, I thought there was a mistake, I overlooked something, but the homicide rates weren't nearly as high as I suspected, or what I expected, again, given high levels of poverty and high levels of what we refer to now as extreme disadvantage. So, and of course, high levels of young males, and all the ingredients that we talk about now is sort of the contributors to violent crime rates. So that was the first thing. The first sort of aha moment, if you will, was that there was this very basic statistic, right? The rate of homicides was much lower than I suspected. Of course, the next issue was, well, why?
Right.
And I think, several people have been examining that why, for several years now. But for me, the important thing again was to continue the original data collection, right? Because I knew or I suspected that it varied, right? That there was this, there were these differences in communities, the differences in communities was what really shaped, right, the Latino homicide rates. And so I went and collected data, not only in Miami and San Diego, with the help of some friends, I collected original homicide data from El Paso. Of course, I incorporated work in Chicago and Houston, some of the early NCOVER projects. Supported this collaboration in Chicago, Houston, and Miami. And then later on, a few years later, I added information from the city of San Antonio. So these are all community level homicide rates or homicide data. And I discovered, as we might suspect, that over time, there were some periods when we had high levels of homicide, right? But they weren't nearly as high as we suspected, right? Given levels of poverty that were, 2 or 3 times higher than that of the national average. Well, okay, we might find Latino homicide rates that were 2 or 3 times higher than that of the national average, but there was never this, super predator stereotype that people were talking about during that time period. There was never this real, extremely high levels of drug-related homicides. There was never this consistent level, right, of extremely high homicides, right, across Latino communities, across time, across different places. And I think that really surprised me, right, because I thought, well, maybe it's just coincidental, maybe it's just 2000, or maybe it's just 1990, maybe it's just 1980, and then the further I went back into time, or the further I went up until the present, it became clear that there was something different, right, about this racial and ethnic group, and that's something that I think many of us are still studying and examining, at least with regards to social and economic characteristics. But I think the difference is that the stereotypes didn't exist; they never really panned out. Even though, perhaps, the political platforms, today, we do hear that stereotype, but there's no evidence or there's no support, as far as I can tell, that supports, right, any of those, any of that rhetoric, right? The reality is very different.
Right. Okay. So just thinking, start your career, we talked about, how you got into criminology, into school. If you were starting your career today, is there something different you would do, or what would you do differently?
What would I do differently? I would learn how to use modern technology differently. What's this thing called? The iPhone or whatever? I just got rid of my beepers, so I would learn how to use modern technology, social media. I would try to become a little bit more savvy about that. But actually, I don't think that helps you, collect data or helps you think about, right, what you're doing. But I think it helps you disseminate your information. I think the thing that I would change now that I didn't systematically follow or pay attention to was, when I was out on the streets, kicking it with the detectives, they were, following they're working these cases, right, over time, and I should have been much more systematic, right, about keeping notes. Right, it's like I had no idea what was going on. I'm just in there to copy these files, and there would be a fresh kill, or a call would come in, and people would take off, and I would go along with them, and I just really didn't keep as many detailed notes as I should have. I should have kept more, recordings, or I should have kept more systematic information about those different events, right, than I did. I still have that information somewhere, but I should have been a little bit more detailed with my notes, right, than I was at the time. And I think part of it's because I realized that homicides are really mundane, right? At least during that time period. Most of it's, most of it's alcohol related, right? Someone's been drinking. Usually they've both been drinking, the victim and the offender. But guess what? Usually they've both been drinking really heavily, right? And they're arguing about something silly, right? Like who won the soccer game, a political argument, admiring somebody in the audience, or they're at the club, and this song's too loud, and so there's these different issues that create or sort of contribute to these arguments, right, that occur. But the arguments are really not something that captures our imagination, right? If we hear about it or read about it, right, it's something that's on the last page of Section B, or the Miami Herald or something, when we used to have newspapers and we would read it every day, and so it really makes the news, so. And I didn't realize, to tell you the truth, about how mundane and routine a lot of homicides are, that especially ones that occur in bars, or that are arguments between neighbors, or fights at liquor stores or in the parking lot, and those are, of course, the most routine types of homicide. They're not dope related, they're not gang related, they're just arguments between people over something mundane. And sometimes it just happens that the offender, gets to their gun or reacts to it quicker than the victim.
Right.
And sometimes it's very difficult to tell the difference between the victim and the offender, at least with respect to who precipitated the event.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. Is there any advice you would give to young scholars or future generations watching this oral history?
Wow.
No, that's heavy.
Yeah.
That's deep. I know you're like, man.
Advice. Do I spell that with an S or a C? I don't know. Advice? I would say just focus on work, right? Just, keep your head down. Just focus on, whatever it is that you're collecting data on, just follow that path, right? Just pay attention to whatever the, research question is that you're trying to answer. Focus on the research question. Don't focus on, anything else that's sort of, surrounding it. And try to answer the research question. The other piece of advice I would give is don't rewrite Genesis, right? I mean, we can all think about it, or we all have this, feeling, initially that we're going to do something big and dramatic, and I would say don't do that, right? Just finish it and worry about that, or worry about the big book or the big hook, later on, once you get your dissertation and once you get tenure. That's my advice.
That's your advice.
Yeah.
I thought that was heavy, man.
Yeah.
I wanted to see where you go with it.
Yeah, don't do Genesis.
Don't do Genesis.
Avoid Genesis.
Where do you see the field sort of going in terms of looking at Latino homicide? Just because there's a growth now, right? And so we look around. There are more Latino scholars, Latino criminologists. I mean, just a really strong network. And I think it's cool to see.
No,
right?
it's really it's a very different world, right? All of a sudden there's this plethora of research, right?
Yes.
Not only of crime, but also criminal justice system comparisons, engagement, qualitative research. The only problem is, I think, especially with respect to homicides, is that there's no data, right? Because 2000, 2010, 2020, we're in this period of all-time homicide declines, right? But, we have this, people are engaged in this activity, but they're not really engaged in studying why we have that decline, right? And they're not really engaged I think, in trying to figure out what contributed, to the decline among Latino homicides relative, relative to the past, right? I'd like to see people going, back to the past, right, to 1960, 1970, right after World War II, when the social and economic characteristics for Latinos, so Mexican Americans in particular, were at an all-time low, right? I think if I remember correctly, in 1950, the years of schooling in San Antonio among the Mexican American population, I think it was 5 or 6, right? It was like an elementary school level was the average, right? In large urban, Mexican American communities. I think I'd like to see if we can engage in some examinations of historical work, right? I mean, we know more work now. We know that data exists. We know that there's this, huge homicide decline. We just don't make a connection to the past, right? There's no concern about these sort of historical conditions, right, or acknowledgments that this group existed when we ignored it. And I think I'd like to see people, sort of go back, at least in the two big, the big two cities, Los Angeles and San Antonio, at least go back in those two places and, get your hands dirty, right? Collect some data. It's okay. You don't have to, that you can't, do everything on, what's this thing called? Whatever it's called, the beeper or whatever.
The beeper, oh yeah.
Whatever it is, that's just because it's not in there, you can, just because it's not in Google, you can go and collect that information too. I think it's important to go back and think about the past, right? Because it's got connections to the present, right? But people aren't really concerned about the past. They're looking at the present, and the present's telling us that we have all-time lows. So that's one issue. The other issue, of course, I think, is we have these very important, right, qualitative and quantitative researchers that are engaged in all sorts of aspects, right, of the experience. They're engaged in all sorts of original data collections. Prolific researchers, very, very important work on the border, for example, in U.S. cities, comparisons to other racial and ethnic groups, looking at, for example, the differences with respect to immigration policing, which is going to be, my concern is I think there's going to be some important changes and important ways in which those styles, right, have sort of changed. The ways in which immigrant and especially Mexican origin Latino communities are viewed, in particular those in the border. But again, people still don't realize that the homicide levels are very low. They're at historic lows right now, but that just is something that I think people need to engage in or think about more. But yeah, it's really exciting now how much there is going on now.
Yeah, I mean, just to see the diversity of ideas and just the diversity within ASC and just having a voice.
Right, it's a very different place than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah. Is there anything that I haven't touched on that you think should be on the record here?
That you haven't touched on?
Yeah.
That's a good question.
I was trying to hit the high points, man. So,
I'm trying to think about that too now.
I know you went back, man, because you were talking about the beeper, man. You went to jump from the beeper to the iPhone. You went past the flip phone or the big phone. That's a time warp, man.
Like, Back to the Future. But actually, I think that's important too, right? Is we have these abilities, right, to look at these different types of temporal and spatial, right, effects that we didn't have, 10 years ago, for sure, 15 years ago, and I think, that's something to consider, right? is the influence of change, right? I mean, we talk about, population change, we talk about immigration change, what happens when immigrants move in, and I agree that's important, but I think it's important to go back to the past and look at, the change as far back as possible as we can, not just necessarily the change between two periods of historical declines, but how about, let's go back to the past in the 80s and 90s when, if I remember correctly, 60, 70, 80, 90, homicide rates for some reason peaked, right, every decade. And I'm not sure we understand why, right? I'm not sure we understand, I think 1970 and 1980, the homicide rate, maybe 60, the homicide rates were just as high as they were during the peak of the crack cocaine epidemic in 1990. We still haven't gone back to see or examine, why that, what the causes or what the consequences of those, peaks were. And of course, how or if they did have a relationship with race and ethnicity. And I think, I think we should go back to the past, right?
Okay.
More than, people suspect. It's easier, I think, to focus on the present because the data exists and, we're able to access data, but it's okay to get your hands dirty too and go back.
Dirty in
and
there.
go back and look at some of these archives and figure out who collected some of this information. I was at a presentation recently and a friend of ours that we know was talking about a homicide data collection in Chicago, the 1965 to, whatever it was, 1990 homicide data collection. And I said, I asked a question. So, well, do you know who collected those data? And they're like, no. And I said, well, it's Richard Block. He's right there in the second row. You don't even, come on, man. Like, get your hands dirty. Look at this. Ask him some questions. How can, why did he start in 1965? Maybe the opportunity to go back is, there, but also, see how he got his hands dirty, right? And that's, I think that's what we need is we need to get our hands a little bit dirtier.
Get dirty, Yeah, I got it. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Ramiro Martinez Jr., for sharing a little bit about your life and your career. And thanks for sharing with us.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to participate, and of course, it's always an honor and a privilege to, serve the American Society of Criminology.